The God of War series has become the PlayStation's improbable marquee series. It's improbable because one might assume its extreme violence wouldn't have mass market appeal. However, is the tragic story of Kratos. His anger, power-hungry madness, and eventual deep regret have resonated with millions of players since 2005. That's an impressive feat for a game and story about family that isn't exactly family-friendly. Fans cannot get enough of Kratos and have followed his journey from Greek mythology to Norse mythology. Most of the games have received huge critical acclaim, with praise for their storytelling, ability to turn mythological gods into compelling characters, groundbreaking visuals, and gaming mechanics. However, not all God of War games are created equal. With God of War Ragnarok set to take the mythological series to new heights, we're looking back at Kratos' history to see which of these great games reigns as a god among them all. Here are all the God of War games, ranked from worst to best. The last in the list is God of War Ascension. It was painfully clear when God of War Ascension debuted that the studio, SCE Santa Monica, was running out of ideas. Building an entire game around Kratos breaking his oath to Ares screams unnecessary, and the execution doesn't assuage any skepticism. The journey here is so forgettable and uninspired that it evaporates from memory as soon as someone completes the campaign. It doesn't help that God of War Ascension crippled the combat, having combos dependent on the player's ability to dodge. On paper, that's a neat concept to mix up the gameplay, but it's frustrating and completely counterintuitive to how the battles had functioned in the first 5 titles. It's another in the line of missteps that hamper Ascension's enjoyment. Ascension did incorporate a multiplayer, but it did not add too much value to the overall package and failed to add much longevity to the game's lifespan. The game is an enjoyable addition to the franchise, but it does not hold the same level of love from fans. The controls are almost identical to previous games and the story is considered less compelling than in other games. The multiplayer was successful, featuring various game modes and maps from within the franchise. It serves as a bonus, but the spin-off is often looked over by new gamers who are looking to get into the main storyline. Coming in at number 8 is God of War Betrayal. God of War Betrayal is, thus far, the only God of War game released for mobile devices. Released in 2007, Betrayal takes place before God of War 2. Framed for murder, Kratos must find the assassin responsible. While its story isn't mentioned in later God of War games, it represents an early wedge between the newly minted God of War, Kratos, and the rest of the Greek gods. While Betrayal doesn't have a Metacritic score, it received high marks for its ability to translate the God of War experience to a 2D, early mobile structure. From its brutality to its quick-time events, Betrayal is a faithful God of War game despite its hardware's limitations. For a mobile game released in 2007, Betrayal is likely to meet expectations. Coming in at number 7 is God of War Chains of Olympus. This prequel proved the franchise can work on a handheld system. God of War Chains of Olympus delivers all the polish and spectacle of a console GAO entry on the PSP, and it feels just as good as ever to slice enemies to ribbons. Unfortunately, the reduced format means the game gets a bit too caught up in block-pushing puzzle solving instead of combat. The story also feels incidental to Kratos and the overarching narrative until the last act. Chains of Olympus is also the shortest console entry in the series, and it does not offer a lot of replay value. Consequently, someone could easily blow through the campaign in an afternoon and find they have nothing left to do outside of repeating the same levels over and over again. That type of experience can work for action games that reward players for mastering their combo-heavy combat systems, but Chains of Olympus does not offer anything like that. Those seeking this game out should pursue the PlayStation 3 port in God of War Origins Collection. This HD version of the game corrects some of the quirky PSP controls, making it the overall definitive version of the game. Nevertheless, Chains of Olympus is a solid portable entry whose biggest weakness is that the other games in the franchise are better. Chains of Olympus was packaged with Ghost of Sparta as part of the PS3's God of War Origins collection, and together they deliver an experience that is roughly equivalent to one of the mainline entries. The original God of War is a classic of the PS2 era and is responsible for a lot of the series' success and future as a viable franchise on PlayStation consoles. Like its successors, God of War delivered the ultimate power fantasy backed up with a genuinely engaging tragedy for a story. It interprets and twists Greek mythology in a way that feels familiar, yet unique, and is a must-play for anyone trying to get into the series for the first time. God of War feels like an actual journey, from the lowest street of Athens to the highest peaks on the cliffs of madness. More importantly, every second of combat feels powerful, flooding the eyes with flurries of color and mayhem as enemies fill the screen. What holds God of War back from claiming the top pick is a distinct lack of boss characters to tackle, with the Hydra, Medusa, the bull-faced Pandora's Temple Guardian and Ares barely filling out the roster. For a game called God of War, it seems striking to have so few figures of ancient history present, even in this first template-setting adventure. In spite of that, the original God of War still has plenty of faults. While it is still an incredibly fun and rewarding experience, it isn't quite as refined as later games in the series. Major sections, especially toward the end of the game, were not as thoroughly tested as other parts of the game. As a result, players often find them incredibly frustrating. For that reason, even an awesome game like God of War falls short of the majority of the games that followed it. The original God of War's over-the-top brutality and action set pieces hooked critics and players alike, leading to its fair share of controversies. However, much of the original game's criticism was aimed at its camera and platforming. Coming in at number 5 is God of War Ghost of Sparta. In terms of story, this is more of a sequel to the first game than the actual sequel. This second PSP entry centers on Kratos' brother, Deimos, and how he was initially thought to bring about the destruction of MT Olympus. Again developed by Ready at Dawn Studios, this is just a better, more streamlined experience than the first PSP title and even the first game. It also has a far more interesting locale in Atlantis, full of life at the beginning and burning and sinking into the ocean just moments after Kratos touches down. Despite being released the same year as the stunning and gorgeous PlayStation 3 entry, this game is probably best experienced in its narrative order right after the 2005 debut. It's how I played it, and it's likely why I rank it higher than the first game. This was also the first game in which series fatigue started to set in, especially considering the bombast of the PlayStation 3's closing chapter. Still, Kratos gets a spear, and it's probably his best weapon of the series outside of his iconic Blades of Chaos and the Leviathan axe of the PS4 and PS5 titles. Ghost of Sparta takes place on the timeline between the events of Betrayal and God of War 2. It covers the most important events during Kratos' tenure as Ares' replacement. The plot distinguishes itself from other games by delving into the human side of Kratos' family as he journeys to the underworld on a quest to save his twin brother. Despite being one of the series' more important spin-offs, it is still not wholly critical to the stories of the mainline games, which is why it ranks toward the back of this list. Taking after other cinematic Sony games, such as The Last of Us, this God of War is about Kratos' relationship with his son, Atreus, years after the events of the original series. The ensuing tale, which deals with the gods of Norse myth, is one of the most grounded in the series to date, and introduced the franchise to a new generation of players. This is exactly the radical reinvention the series needed in 2018. The PS4's God of War is a more methodical adventure guided mostly by character. An older Kratos coming to terms with his past and trying to build a better future for his son makes for an exceedingly compelling relationship, and the pair's attempts to find common ground are some of the most poignant moments in the series. 2018's. The story is refreshingly small in scale. Despite the DNA of the series, Kratos, along with his son, Atreus, fulfill his wife's final request to scatter her ashes across the tallest peak in the 9 realms of Norse mythology. Against their will, they are forced into conflict with the local gods. Kratos now realizes his actions throughout the entire original trilogy amounted to nothing, and he desperately wants to avoid exposing his son to such depravity. Despite being a funeral march, or perhaps because of it, Kratos' adventure with his son plumbs the consequences of toxic masculinity and absent fatherhood, and the work it takes to repair a broken relationship. These risks paid off, and the game is a masterpiece. With beautiful visions, huge-scale action sequences, and the most emotional storyline to date, the game brought back the love for the franchise while spawning a whole new generation of fans. The novelty of the transition from the original trilogy to the reboot has faded since the 2018 game's release, but that doesn't take anything away from its improbable success. Among the PlayStation 4's incredible archive of exclusive titles, this God of War is among the easiest to recommend to almost anyone. Coming in at number 3 is God of War 3. In retrospect, it seems so obvious that the God of War series would find a nice home on the then next-generation console, complete with improved graphics, bigger combat scenarios and quite literally the death of all Greek mythology and society on display. Mechanically, the development team embraced Kratos' final leg of vengeance with a flair for the violent and magical. Instead of acting as separate tools, magical abilities are imbued into Kratos' weapons themselves, demanding a more varied and quick-witted approach to combat. Kratos also receives the ability to grapple with enemies and fling them away, and to use them as a battering ram, giving a more visceral style to Kratos' bloodlust. Now that Kratos was in the home stretch, the buffet of Greek gods left alive afforded him plenty of chances to exact horrific justice upon Mount Olympus. Whether it was pulverizing Zeus in a first-person point of view until the screen went red, scaling the gargantuan titan Kronos to skewer him through the head or watching Poseidon's miserable death through his own eyes, God of War 3 did not screw around. Unfortunately, for every striking moment of violence or anti-heroism, the writing behind the game seemed to forget that Kratos was supposed to be at least something resembling a character, rather than the shouting, stalking totem of rage he had become. If you're looking for an emotional or narrative payoff that results in more than additional bloodshed, you've come to the wrong place. Coming in at number 2 is God of War 2. No other game set the stakes higher than this one. While cliffhangers are tricky to get right, Cory Barlog's directorial debut lays claim to having the most tantalizing cliffhanger ever written in the medium. It starts with Kratos, a small but mighty god, being betrayed by Zeus, and ends with him literally cutting the threads of fate that bind him so he could ride a titan as he declares war on the Greek gods. That Barlog started out as an animator on this series is telling. Kratos' movement distinguishes him from other action game protagonists, even as it wears its inspirations, Capcom's Devil May Cry and Street Fighter series, on its sleeve. It's that fighting game mentality that locks in how tight fights feel. The game has an innate understanding of spectacle that contributes to this sense that Barlog isn't just animating Kratos, he's animating the entire world and its destruction around him. There's a sharper focus on cinematic action, and this time, the Santa Monica studio team has full command of the PS2's capabilities. This second game is often called the swan song of the PS2, history's best-selling gaming console. And the best of the bunch is God of War Ragnarok. With 2018's God of War, Santa Monica confidently launched a new era in Kratos' story, one that set high expectations for the foreshadowed sequel. Except for perhaps Elden Ring, Ragnarok might be the biggest game of 2022, and the game is more than capable of carrying the weight burdened by this attention. On the surface, the sequel does not deviate too far from its predecessor, offering hefty combat alongside smart character work. However, Ragnarok is not happy to merely retread past glories, and the game smartly picks which areas to evolve and how best to expand upon them. Out of all of Kratos' adventures so far, God of War Ragnarok is hands down the best. From the way it evolves the gameplay from God of War 2018 to the growth of both Kratos and Atreus as characters, everything that worked in the franchise's previous installment has been doubled down on here. The environments are prettier, the animations are more fluid, and combat has never felt better. Ragnarok didn't fix what wasn't broken. players well attuned to the previous God of War will feel right at home. Ragnarok features greater depth in both combat and story, both of which saw overwhelming praise from critics. What's next for God of War is unknown, but it's safe to say that the Norse duology contains two of the best games, not just in the God of War series, but of all time. Telling a gripping story about grief, anger, and regret, Ragnarok is a character-driven epic that balances quieter personal moments and large-scale set pieces.
Thanks for watching. For more videos, subscribe to this channel and also give your feedback in comments section.